Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you to the first American Constitution Society co-sponsored event of the year. We are bringing to you ALEC. ALEC stands for the American Legislative Issue and Campaign Exchange. As many of you may already know, the American Constitution Society, pretty much their goal is to educate on progressive policy. And so what we do is bring speakers on campus who can speak to the political discourse, the political landscape, what's going on in politics, and how that relates to the Constitution. Just recently, the American Constitution Society on the national level partnered with ALEC, and I think that partnership is a beautiful one because ALEC and ACS go hand in hand. And you can think of ACS as kind of the think tank, and then think of ALEC as the do tank, where we take the ideas that we've come up with at ACS and really try to implement them through drafting progressive model legislation. Those of you who don't know, ALEC has a progressive online library where it compiles good model laws, progressive model laws, as well as exemplary laws, which are already laws that are existing. And so I think that it's really important for those who are members of democracy to be stewards of that democracy, because when people fail to live up to their obligation to be stewards of that democracy, a lot of chaos ensues. The democracy starts to fail. And we are seeing that right now with a lot of the different regressive legislation that is being put in place literally overnight. There's right-to-work laws which have sprung up in places such as Michigan, which has been a bastion of labor, the labor movement, labor unions, workers' rights, and yet right-to-work legislation completely takes away the First Amendment right to collectively organize. There's also the voting rights issues that are going on, where after the Constitution, the Supreme Court held on doing away with the formula for pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act, overnight, again, many different state legislators or state legislatures started to implement anti-voting laws, and then also too abortion clinics, right? We're seeing them close almost overnight. States only have like one abortion clinic open. So I think it's really important, and I'm really glad that you guys have come so that you can see how you can get involved with what we're doing here with ALEC. I'd like to take some time now to introduce our panelists. Chris Taylor graduated cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania and went on to attend the University of Wisconsin Law School, where she received her JD. As a college student, Chris volunteered for Planned Parenthood and worked at an advocacy organization for battered women. She has a long career as an advocate for basic human rights. In 2003, she started working for Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin as the policy and political director. And over the last 8 years, Chris has led PPWI to many landmark victories for women's health during some very difficult times. She was one of the driving forces behind the passage of the Compassionate Care for Rape Victims Act. She also has sat at the coalition table with the labor community, environmental advocates, the LGBT community, and other progressive partners for the last 8 years to develop and implement strategies that would further the progressive agenda in the state of Wisconsin. Chris has also been on the State Bar's Public Interest Law section, leading the legislative subcommittee, secretary for the Legal Association for Women, a member of the League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club, NARAL, Pro-Choice Wisconsin, and Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Professor Rogers is a professor of law, political science, sociology, and public affairs at the University of Wisconsin. And he also directs the Center on Wisconsin Strategy, which is the National High Road Strategy Center. He has written widely on American politics and the democratic theory, advised many political movements, and helped found and operate several progressive NGOs. For example, the Center for a New Democracy, New Party, Economic Analysis Research Network, the Apollo Alliance, Emerald Cities Collaborative, and now ALEC. Along with many academic honors, Professor Rogers is a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Prize. And in addition, Newsweek has identified him as one of the 100 living Americans most likely to shape U.S. politics and culture in the 21st century. Professor David Marcello has a long history of involvement with public interest advocacy and with administrative and legislative processes in Louisiana, including serving as statewide coordinator for the Conservation Coalition, which is a Louisiana statewide environmental lobby. He also founded and directed the Louisiana Center for the Public Interest, LCPI. He also founded Louisiana's first public interest law firm. He acted as executive counsel to Mayor Ernest Morial of New Orleans, represented city agencies and employees in public bidding, open meetings, public records, zoning, and other public sector legal concerns. He's also chaired Mayor Morial's 40-member Charter Revision Advisory Committee and the first successful comprehensive revision of New Orleans Home Rule Charter. As far as private practice goes, Professor David Marcello has represented a variety of clients in administrative and legislative matters, serving as general counsel to the Regional Transit Authority. He secured legislation that allowed the 1984 World's Fair to transfer property at the end of the 6-month run to the Rouse Corporation and made possible Rouse's $60 million Riverwalk development on New Orleans riverfront. He subsequently represented Rouse in obtaining an exemption from Sunday closing laws for the Riverwalk project. He has also served as staff attorney for the New Orleans Legal Assistance Corporation, as legal consultant for an urban planning firm, and as counsel for several neighborhood associations. As executive director of the Joint Tulane Loyola Public Law Center, Professor Marcello runs the legislative and administrative advocacy clinics and teaches courses on legislation and agency rulemaking. So with that, I'd like to open it up to our panelists for discussion.
Hi everybody, I'm delighted you're here. Thank you for having us, and thanks to Ngozi and other folks at ACS for organizing it. I want to do just the starter thing to tell you what ALEC is in a little bit more detail than Ngozi was able to, and why we think it's important, and then how you can get involved if you want to. So ALEC, again, is the American Legislative and Issue Campaign Exchange, and it's a public library of progressive state and local law, and then arguments in support of them, written supports and argument for them would be another way to put it. Another way to describe it, though, for law students in particular, is it's a way for you to use your brain finally to actually improve your country. And what I'd like to talk about then is why bother at all, why we're doing it now, and then how, if you want to, you can help. But let me just first describe the basic elements of ALEC. What it is. It's this public library. We're relatively new. We just started in 2012. It's web-based, obviously. It's peer-produced. We get contributions from a huge number of people all over the country, activist groups, law professors, public policy stuff, et cetera. It's open source platform. We're using software which is all open source. Ruby on Rails, Blacklight, Apache Solar. It's full text searchable. It's very easily, it's easy to find around. And it's got these laws. And the laws include conventional legislation, but they also include executive orders, regulation, even some citizen originating laws like initiative and referenda. And those are sorted by all, major areas of state policy. State policy is basically about everything from public safety to economic development, to the environment, to health, to economic security, to democracy, voting rights. There are a lot of issues in state policy. We've carved it into 14 major issue areas, and we sort all this stuff by those areas. And then within that, more detailed subject matters within those. And then we also have a whole bunch of tags and other things for you to enable your search of the site. And that's also sorted by the level of government, the date of enactment of the law, where it came from, the state or the city or whatever. And then these laws are categorized in two broad categories. One is exemplary laws, by which we mean a law which has been introduced or passed or enacted somewhere that we think is worthy of replication elsewhere. And we currently have a little bit over 1,000 of those up on the site. And then there are model laws in the conventional sense of model law, that is standard language that has most of the elements needed for a law, that you can have in general enough language you can interpret it and apply it to your particular state and hand it over. We do stuff in enough detail that we think you can just basically give it to your ledge counsel if you're a legislator. And we have about 233, well, exactly 233 of those as of this morning. We've got another 40 or 50 in the pipeline, and we have another 100 or so at least targeted right now. And those are the model laws. And then the supports that's sort of a residual category. It includes anything that can help you make the argument. That could be polling data, talking points, cost-benefit analyses of a particular change in policy, some sort of policy evaluation, some case study, anything like that. And we have a bunch of those up now as well. All the work on ALEC is done, the sort of secretariat here in Madison is staffed by just a few people, very able people here, many of them in the audience here. It's a tiny little staff we have here. But then we get stuff from a number of other people and are coordinated with a number of other people. Say David, for example, among them. We've got about 100 plus contributing public interest or advocacy organizations of different kinds, or NGOs. And then we've got faculty and other students, and students at about 75 plus universities, usually heavy representation from the law schools, some public policy schools, some economics departments, et cetera. But we've got basically a lot of people out there contributing in one way or another. And sometimes that contribution is to actually provide us with a model. In some cases it's to scout for us to find an exemplary law. In some cases it's to review models that we're in the process of curating or developing ourselves. But all these people in different ways are helping. You got to understand ALEC is definitely a collaborative project. Okay, and that's the website. I understand from Sam you can't put it on your laptop right now, but you can look it up pretty easily. Okay, so let's go through the three things I wanted to talk about, which is just why bother, and then why we're doing it now, and then how you can get involved. And I'll try to be pretty quick here. So why bother? Basically, we bother because we consider ourselves true patriots. We take seriously Lincoln's injunction that each generation try to advance in its own time, the radical founding ideals of this country. And we think that we're losing out and thus make progress on that. As we use the word progressive, it's not a nicer way of saying liberal. It means somebody who's taking that Lincolnian challenge seriously, wants to make progress in our time. But we're not making progress. We're basically losing out right now in American politics. Progressives are losing out. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And a lot of them are pretty familiar to you, and I don't propose to go through them in any detail. I'll just go through the usual litany here. Internationalization and increased competition and new demands on government that government turns out not to be particularly good at answering. And then there's tremendous financialization, which has increased risk and the effects of leverage, increasing risk basically in the economy. A restructuring of the economy with firm deconcentration, introducing all sorts of fissures in the workforce and new opportunities for business to exploit labor. A completely decrepit media in the U.S. case, corporate dominated, entertainment oriented, et cetera. Huge increase in inequality in the U.S. Now, several times that of other advanced rich countries. This is not about capitalism, gang. It's about a peculiar American form of capitalism. And then a limiting, unaccountable, often dysfunctional political system. Look at what we're about to do in D.C. This week and next. Rest the case. And then the absence of a shared progressive narrative, a way of talking about what we're doing now to answer Lincoln's charge, and certainly a program or a political project. And given all that, a sort of disappearing public in many ways, given all of the above. And some moral progress. The moral progress is I think Americans, or I think progressives have basically won most of the cultural wars. In the last 40 years. I say this in full recognition of the fact that people are trying to roll that back in different ways right now. But we certainly lost all the political and economic ones. I mean, when you look at the condition of the working class, when you look at the level of progressive political power, it's much worse off than it was before. And while there are lots of reasons for that, I think one of them is that all those things have undermined progressive, politics at the national level. But one thing that is remediable easily is our pretty extraordinary neglect of available opportunities for organizing at the state and local level. And that's basically what ALEC is intended to do. The argument we want to make, or we do make in ALEC, is that state and local government is really, really important, and it's also organizable. But it's basically being taken over by people who do not have the interests of the country really at heart, and who are opposed to what most of what the country is supposed to be about. What's the country supposed to be about, in our view? Equal opportunity, equal say, something like a democratic government. And these people are in the process of destroying it. Now, how far along how important is state policy? To take the first part of that argument, well, I think pretty important. It's obviously the only part of American government with reserved, presumptively plenary powers, and it's the part where most of the essentials of what most people would regard as a decent life are pretty much decided. Most of the stuff around education, the quality of your kids' schooling, is pretty much decided at the state and local level, or SLG, what I'll sometimes call state and local government, SLG. Similarly with the environment. You hear about the EPA and the Clean Air Act and everything else, but most of the environment stuff is going to be driven by transportation decisions, land use decisions, water decisions, and a bunch of other things that are basically controlled at the state level. Energy, you would think that that's a matter of national regulation. In fact, it's not. I mean, whether you're using clean energy or dirty energy, coal plants or wind power, solar power for most of your energy is pretty much entirely determined at the state level. Transportation, equally. Of all the public dollars that go into transportation, or all the dollars go into transportation, the federal government spends maybe 3 cents on the dollar. States spend another 9 or 10 cents, and then the rest is spent by private people who are navigating the built environment that state and local governments construct for them. So states basically completely dominate the transportation choices. Similarly with housing, we don't have much of a national housing policy, and the degree to which you have access to housing in a way which is not discriminatory, which is mixed use and open to people of varied income, and that's pretty much determined at the state and local level. Sanitation even, sewer treatment, water, it goes on and on. Land use, we mentioned already. Public safety, whether your cops are well-trained or not is going to be determined at the local level, and whether they are able to abuse you is going to be determined pretty much by SLG, state and local government. Public recreation, whether you're parks or not, whether near your neighborhood or not. So-called new civil rights, like the ability of gay people to enter the sanctified institution of marriage. But more generally, enforcement of almost all kinds, including old civil rights, is pretty much done at the state and local level. And above all, and finally, let's end the list here, state and local governments, particularly state governments, control basically everything around the election process. Who gets to be able to vote, how much public money is subsidizing it versus private money, how long the lines are at the voting place, how you go about voting, et cetera, and also controls critically the decennial process of redistricting, which the people who are now in charge of state government have basically wired in a way that it prevents even substantial majorities on the other side from actually getting power. You see that in many, many states, including your own one of Wisconsin right now, where in the last election, Democrats actually seated Republicans in total number of votes at the state level for state office, but came nowhere near recognizing that or reflecting that in the actual composition of the legislature. Okay, and then also compared to federal government, if you just want to look at scale for a second, the federal government right now is basically an insurance company with a very big army and doesn't do a lot of discretionary spending. State and local government has 7 times the number of civilian workforce employees. It does 4 times the consumption and investment, and critically, it has 7 times the amount of non-military discretionary spending at its disposal, and does that. It's also got about $3 trillion in public employee pension assets. So, a trillion here, a trillion there. Pretty soon you could do some, serious money, serious damage, or serious help in economic development. And it's got its hands on all sorts of other useful money, like the $8 billion it's spent every year by utilities as sort of a bribe to not throw them over, and actually is supposed to be spent on renewable energy or energy efficiency. So there's a lot here. There's a lot in states. How completely has it been taken over? You know, I think pretty completely, or we think pretty completely, by a quite radicalized Republican Party, which is basically doing the service of a much more confident new American right. And there are various ways of measuring that, but maybe the simplest way is just to look at the decline in Democratic presence in state and local government. Not that I stupidly identify all Democrats as progressive, but I'm at this point pretty confident that most Republicans are not going to be that, so we can just take the obverse. And what does that look like? It looks pretty significant. Let's take from 1974, just a few months after an organization we'll talk about in a second, ALEC, was founded, to the current period. What's the share of partisan legislative seats the Democrats had then and now? Well, it went from 68 to 47%. That's a decline of 31%. Governorships, tremendous decline there, almost a half. Number of controlled chambers in state legislatures, again, about a half. Number of controlled legislatures, again, more than half. This is tremendous decline over this 40-year period. Number of controlled states, again, about half. So that's a tremendous Democratic decline. And it's important to note that the more radicalized GOP that's gaining here is actually uses its power once in office to reward and strengthen those who put it there, and also to enact so-called game changer reforms, that is, changes in the rules themselves, many of which are going to be with us for a long time to come because they've been constitutionalized. It takes years to get rid of this stuff. Now, you might think, sophisticates among you, that this all is about the loss of the South, but it's actually not. It is partly about the loss of the South, but a lot of this decline continued even in the post-Clinton period. Here's the share of the decline. That's what that thing there, that's just, delta, sigma delta. What does that stand for? It's not a new fraternity, it's just the total, the share of the total decline. And the change over that is attributable in those different periods. So this is the share of the total decline attributable to that period. Or I'm sorry, the share of the total decline, that is a period, the decline from 74 to 2013 in the period mentioned. So you get about, a large part of the share in the loss of the South, that's no question about it. But you get very substantial decline. You get that in the number of controlled legislatures and controlled states. That is where you have the governor and the state legislature in the same party. But a very substantial part of the decline actually continues after you lose the South. The share of partisan legislative seats, 60% of the overall decline goes on there. The governorships, which is really critical, almost 60% of that goes on since '94. Number of controlled chambers, which is the basic thing that you want to make sure you have control over, because that enables you either to block or to begin to assemble the controlling legislative majorities that you need to really push policy. Most of that, again, is since 1994. And notice also that this thing is largely robust against movement at the national level. So Barack Obama, as you may have noticed, won the last election, and nationwide there was definitely a pro-democratic vote in Congress. You didn't see it in Congress, and again, you didn't see it much in the states because of the successful gerrymandering. And so even though Democrats gained a little bit back in 2012, basically the GOP held steady and in fact increased the number of states that it fully controls. That is where you have a governor of a certain party and both houses of the legislature of the same party. That's now virtually half of America right there, and that's pretty rock hard and against quite radicalized GOP stuff. Negotiators is going through some of the things that they're currently doing. None of it's pretty. Maybe Chris will talk about some more. So how did all this happen? Well, it happened basically because the new American right has built over the last 40 years, since roughly the Powell memo, the famous memo that Lewis Powell, before going on the bench, wrote to his friends at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a very successful infrastructure, a set of tools that they share that is important to doing politics. I mean, politics is it's not just a contact sport, it's sort of a collision sport. You need to have some equipment to do it. You need to have elements of this infrastructure. What Powell said, urging the right, business leaders on the right to do, is make a plan, stick with it a long time through reversals and so on. And when you read his memo, and I really think it's worth reading if you haven't looked at it already, he said, you've got to have a consistency of action over an indefinite period with a lot of money. And basically what the right's done over the last 40 years is do that. What do I mean by this infrastructure? Well, think of it as 7 functional capacities of any highly successful social movement or political movement that wants to take power. Basically, you need mechanisms of communication to your base, trusted mechanisms of communication to your base, within your leadership, to the general public. You need new blood, or blood as a new blood. You can think of this as CBSM to the power of 4. New blood, youth. You want to be constantly recruiting young people in, training them, loving them, surrounding them, telling them they can have a life in the movement as well as their own life. You need a message and program, obviously. It's got to be something relatively actionable and simple and forward-looking, ideally with momentum. You need a ton of messengers that are trained in how to speak in public. Many of them running for office, many of them not, but just around and about. You need a certain amount you need models that you can lift up. You know, a Prop 13 here, a Tabor there, or this or that innovation in terms of constraining democracy. And spreading, and then you need a certain amount of money. It needs to be deep. Above all, it needs to be reliable, so that you can suffer setback. It can't just be something which is provided every 2 years, or worse still, every 4 years. It's got to be something that's built, that's supplied on a more or less constant basis. Because politics doesn't stop after elections. In fact, in many ways, politics only begins after elections. And then you need a variety of other things. Here's a residual category called service centers. You know, you need ways, chop shops of different sorts in policy. Again, you know, I don't know, I wouldn't recommend this acronym much, but if you can keep those 7 things in your head, I find it easy to think of them as CBSM4. Anyway, now the right, having built this infrastructure, was able to move it into the states pretty easily, because states are very, very vulnerable to business. They're very porous. They've got more than 500,000 or 540,000 elective offices. And so if you know exactly where you want to go, it's usually sufficiently obscure to the general public that you can get the result that you want. And the legislative branch is chronically underfunded and understaffed. And so they're very susceptible to influence from outside. Often deliberately pre-professional. Most are part-time. They're not paid much. Very little staffing again. Most talented are often looking for a way out, because people think of state government as just this place that's not quite ready for prime time, and what you should really do is get into the federal game. I think that's less so in the last few years, but for a long time people say, state government, that's irrelevant. And among state legislatures, and here are the numbers, it only gets worse at the local level in terms of staffing. You can see that the possibilities for dominance, if you have some money to dominate people with, are pretty legion. The number of registered lobbyists outnumbers staff more than 2 to 1 in state legislatures, and it outnumbers the number of actual elected people, for example, 5 to 1, better than 5 to 1. And so in part of the way in which the right did this, beyond the general infrastructure I talked about, concerns the organization that obversely sort of gives us our name, the American Legislative Exchange Council. You'll recall that in 2011, after major gains in the so-called Tea Party elections, and the gains were pretty considerable. There they are for you. You know, lots and lots of individual seats, lots of controlled chambers, lots of controlled legislatures, lots of new governorships, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people expressed, and those are all the states that were actually controlled fully by the end of the 2010 election. A lot of people were sort of genuinely surprised, shocked to see broadly identical anti-labor, anti-voter, anti-clean energy, anti-all the good stuff bills suddenly introduced in a variety of states all at once. And gradually, the herd of independent spirits, known as our national press, came and informed us, oh, it was all done because of a secretive organization known as ALEC. But actually, ALEC had been around for about 40 years. It's just celebrated its 40th anniversary of pushing for lower wages, less health care, more gun violence, and other of its many achievements. It was favored by Ronald Reagan. It's for political cognoscenti, or not even cognoscenti, but people active in local politics. It's been known and recognized as a major force in state politics during all of that period, particularly, say, the last 30 years. Now, ALEC is a relatively small organization. It's got a relatively small budget. In 2010, when all these things were going on, its reported budget was only $7.2 million. Most of that's, of course, provided by corporations and then the corporate sponsored conferences that they do. But it's still not a hell of a lot of money. They have a fair number of state legislators, but not too impressive. They got 2,000 of them involved. They do have presence around the country. Here's the map of the country and how much of different state legislatures they claim membership within. But you know, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but they have tremendous legislative impact. And the easiest way to say that is just look at the voting rights laws. Before 2010, there were just 2 states, Georgia and then Indiana, which is basically Georgia in the Midwest, that had voter ID laws. And I've said this to people in Georgia and in Indiana, they're not offended, or at least some of them aren't offended. But after 2010, this is the number of states that had them, and now it's going on, by the way, in the last session, this is expanded even further. That is an amazing level of being able to coordinate and get a bunch of stuff going suddenly in what is supposed to be a competitive federalism in which every state is different. You know, you met one state, you met one state. And this is obviously not a case of every state being different. How does ALEC do this? Well, it introduces model bills and makes those available. These are produced by joint committees of business people and legislators on its 8 principal task forces. Then they're marketed and, you know, and they're advertised as, you know, good for you, of course, you know, defending the right to do this and do that and, you know, blah, blah, blah. They're, in fact, of course, about different things, about pollution and, well, all these things here. You should be laughing and you're not. That's another, there you go, yeah. Another failed attempt at humor here. Okay. Anyway, but that's what they're really about. And they leverage a tremendous amount of corporate political power and government affairs, aka lobbying power. There's still a bunch of corporations very involved in ALEC, about 171, I think, at last count. And they include a lot of people who are famous not only on the right, but in everyday household appliances and whatever. And that probably contributes, just in the time that those people put in, probably another $300 million. But the real power of ALEC is that it actually successfully leverages the rest of this infrastructure that I was talking about before. In the case of ALEC, what that means is, yeah, you've got the 171 corporations, but you've also got very well articulated relations with right-wing funders of different sorts, like the Kochs and the Coors and the Scapes and people like that. But you've also got the party establishment on the other side. You've got a bunch of leadership training. Remember that new blood and recruitment of people? The right spends much more on this than progressives. Then you got a bunch of ties to mass organizations, lots of which are functional organizations. They're really giving people something. They're not just, you know, pushing a right-wing agenda in the case of the NRA on the Second Amendment. They're also giving, you know, dismemberment insurance, which is very expensive if you buy it outside the NRA. Or in churches, they're giving salvation, which is very, very difficult to buy anywhere. And then it's got a bunch of mass and retail communication. Drive around anywhere in America on the AM stuff, or even increasingly the FM. And it's basically Fox, Salem, Sinclair, Christian Broadcasting, etc. It's got a bunch of single advocacy groups that's closely coordinated. It's got a bunch of multi-issue think tanks, and it's got a coordination thing at the state level called the State Policy Network. And ALEC is basically able to count on all of that infrastructure when it pushes out one of those model bills. Now, there's ALEC, you know, and what to do about it. Well, we decided to do, you know, you could do a, you know, Alfred E. Newman, What Me Worry, just, I don't know, sort of weep or put your, you know, go to sleep under the covers or pull the covers over your head or whatever. What we decided to do is do this thing called ALICE. And you can't hear this guy now, but apparently. Anyway, this is Bill Moyers singing our praises. So what he's basically saying is, ALEC, meet Alice. And even though Alice is pathetic and funded by volunteers and ALEC has all the money, maybe, you know, like the story of David and Goliath, maybe David will win. I don't know, Bill. I don't know. But whether it does or not will depend, I do know this, entirely on people like you and people a little bit older than you and people instructing you now and then the lawyers that you hope to become and that are around. And so why are we doing this now? Well, we're doing it now because for a very long time, progressives ignored all this stuff going on the right for a very long time. It basically did nothing about the rights efforts. And there are a variety of progressive delusions that led to that. Maybe some, you know, maybe excess pride, maybe real simple stupidity. Who knows? You know, people say, oh, we're doing fine. We don't need to organize. Or we know what we're doing. This is in favor of the unions. Stay out of my face. You don't know anything about the labor movement. Or We don't need politics, just social movements. That was partly, that's what the left often said. Or identity is more important than inequality, the whole phase of identity politics in the 70s and 80s and on into part of the 90s. Or we don't agree on anything, that's a favorite among the intellectuals. Or Democrats will save us, who knows whom that's a favorite among anymore. But large numbers of the public still sort of think that. Or maybe Barack will save us, even if previous Democrats didn't. Or maybe tweeting or Facebook will save us. Anyway, these things get more and more ridiculous over time. Basically, nothing's going to save us unless we get organized. And the reason we're doing it now is that some people are finally getting organized in this space. You've got the State Policy Alliance, which is a giant table of people active in state and local politics. You've got the Committee on States, which is a completely boring name as a State Policy Alliance, but it's basically about the same thing. You've got a variety of organizations. I won't give you all the names of the organizations, but basically, finally, for the first time in my memory, the progressive side at the state and local politics is getting some money and getting their act together a little bit to begin to counter the right. And their explicit aim, and this again is not quite showing up, but their explicit aim is to develop a little bit something like the infrastructure that the right has built up. So in all this project, ALEC should be thought of a little slice in a much bigger sandwich, or thin slice of salami or vegan, whatever, I don't know, some tiny little thing. But it's a critical slice because it's the program stuff. If all this other stuff works, and it is underway now, if all the people are now getting trained to run for office and all the coordination going on in several, not all states, but many states, including this one to some degree, and Chris can say something about how successful that is. If that goes forward, there are going to be a lot of people coming into state and local politics who are more like your age than mine, and they're going to want programs. They're going to want concrete things to do. And that's basically what ALEC is going to provide. So how can you help if this seems interesting? Well, if you're a student, and most of you seem like students, first thing, if you're a student, I guess, basically, we don't want to get in the way of your progress on the degree, and your chief goal should be to become an alumnus of this august law school. But if you want to help, just go on the site, look around, ask for the list of priorities, which we have on new stuff, see if there's something interesting to you. Just look around. I mean, literally look around. And if you have general interest in helping, but you don't know exactly where you want to help, just tell us that. But just let us hear from you. You'll hear back relatively quickly. I think within 2 days is what we try to stick to. And despite this incredibly small and overworked staff, we usually meet that. And then working with you, we'll put together a plan on you doing something. It could be a note, it could be a comment, it could be a new model bill, it could be a search for additional exemplary laws, it could be a search for additional supports. Any number of things of the sort that are on this site, we need help with, all of them. We've done this with, I don't know if it's hundreds of students at this point, but it's a lot of students in schools all over the country, and it can be done. And you got to get someone to sponsor you. I don't know if there are any faculty here, but faculty, you need to get a faculty person or a practicing lawyer or somebody, quasi-adult, not that you're not all young adults, but somebody with more power than you do, right? You have right now, local, to oversee you, because we want to get some quality control here. You get the plan approved by both the supervisor and us, and then get to work, and then have a good time and do a great job and tell your friends about it, and watch what happens in the world. We've already get some effects of stuff that students have done. Tell others about the experience, and take it away. And what else you do with and then you can organize in different ways, form a chapter, as many of the ACS chapters are doing. They're doing a sort of ALEC subchapter, and they're we don't really have we're not married to ACS, but we're sort of doing very serious dating, and we're in all cases we found them very, very helpful as a structure to extend our reach in law schools. David Marcello will tell you a little bit about how many clinics we're getting into, as well as other law school faculty and students, but whatever. And then what else you do in law school, it's your business. Have some fun, get some sleep, make friends, fall in love. I don't really, I'm not going to give you instruction. Are there any faculty here? Yeah. Oh, good. Well, if you're faculty, there's lots of ways you can help, but there's a big point for faculty that based on horrible experience, the faculty say, oh, I can't do that, although it's great that you're doing it. I just want to stress, which is that and so I'm going to put it in ugly type and make it bounce for you, just to make sure this really gets through. You really don't need to know anything about drafting. Is that Thomas there? Well, see, he actually knows something about that. All right. But anyway, a lot of people don't know anything about drafting, and you really don't need to know anything about drafting, okay? or even have any interest in learning how to do it, to be quite useful to the project. Among things you could do are all of these things. And look at the list, there's a zillion things that you could do, all sorts of ways in which you could help, and other faculty at other schools are currently helping, less so, unfortunately, in Wisconsin, and short of giving a model law, okay? So there's a zillion things. We give you that list again if you want to help, which I certainly hope you all do. Anyway, that's ALEC, okay? That went on longer than I had hoped, and there was a fair amount of information, but let's now turn it over to our distinguished, wonderful Representative Chris Taylor, who will tell you about why it might be useful.
Well, I'm really delighted to be here. I really appreciate being invited. I do serve in the state legislature, I'm in the state assembly, and I represent many of you, if not probably most of you, in the state legislature. And you got a little bit of my background. I came here for law school. My gosh, it's been 20 years almost, which I can't believe. But really came to law school because I was interested in social justice issues, which I've always been interested in. When I was a little kid, I was always very interested in civil rights and women's rights, and came here to law school to pursue kind of those interests, and really never thought that I would run for public office. I really didn't until February of 2011. And there was a lot going on in the state during that time. A lot of things I did not agree with. I very vehemently opposed not just what was happening with collective bargaining, but also what was happening with public education and the essential defunding, in my opinion, of public education by this governor. It was not the ideal time for me to run. I had a 6-month-old baby. I had a 4-year-old child. But I honestly could not stand it. So the seat came open. I couldn't stand what was happening in the state. I thought at least this was something for me to do positively. And so I did run, and now I'm very fortunate to represent the Near East Side of Madison, the Isthmus, downtown, and I go all the way over to Edgewood College. When I was contemplating running for the legislature, I was very perplexed with where some of these issues were coming from. We really had not had a dialogue in the state about taking away collective bargaining rights. In fact, Wisconsin had been a leader in workers' rights. AFSCME, one of the big public unions, had started in Wisconsin. We had this very long tradition of respecting workers' rights. We were one of the first states in 1910 to pass a constitutional workers' compensation system. So we had this long history of supporting workers, and it was quite perplexing to me where this attack on workers was coming from, because we hadn't had a discussion about it. Likewise, the attack on public education. Where is that coming from? I have never had a constituent contact me saying we shouldn't fund our public schools, never. And I suspect most of my colleagues on the other side have had very few constituent contacts saying we don't want to fund our public schools. I just don't think that is what they're hearing about. So my interest in where these policies came from really started when I was running, and then I got to the legislature and started seeing more weird policies. I certainly was not getting constituent contacts on passing shoot-to-kill policies in the state of Wisconsin, which essentially, we have a castle doctrine in the state of Wisconsin which allows someone to use lethal force, deadly force against anybody who's unlawfully on their premises, and the use of that force does not have to be reasonable. In fact, there's a presumption that the use of deadly force is reasonable. So we saw that bill, and I thought, this is weird. Where is this coming from? Then we had another bill shortly after that on special ed vouchers. How many of you know what voucher schools are? People familiar with that term? Okay, so it's a program that actually has existed in Milwaukee for about 20 years, where taxpayer money goes to subsidize private education for what was supposed to be low-income students, to address some of the achievement gap things that we were seeing in Milwaukee. It has not addressed that, but that was the purported purpose. What we saw this last session, and what happened actually this session, is an expansion of private unaccountable voucher schools, so that we now have a statewide voucher school system. But the other little piece of that we saw was an attempt to pass a bill that established special education vouchers, meaning a child with disabilities could get $15,000 that could be paid to a private school. And the private school did not have to offer any kind of special ed curriculum, no special training for instructors, and no individualized educational plan had to be followed. I thought, okay, this is really weird. And so we actually we started tracing where this legislation came from, and came back to ALEC, actually. That's where it came from. And then started looking at the money, how much money had been spent on private school vouchers on lobbying, or private school voucher groups on lobbying for this, and it was immense. And then we looked at the recall and saw the money coming in from these voucher groups. And so it inspired me to learn a little bit more about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. I had a colleague, Mark Pocan, who now represents you in Congress, who had done some really, really important work on ALEC and what it was and what it was doing when he was in the legislature and started to see these bills that we weren't hearing, that constituents wanted these bills. We weren't hearing a public outcry for the passage of these bills. So where were they coming from? So he started the work of going to these ALEC conferences. And I kind of inherited that job from him when he went off to Congress. So I really appreciated Joel's kind of summary of ALEC. I kind of had the real world experience of actually going to an ALEC conference just a month or so ago in August, and they were celebrating their 40th anniversary. And I just wanted to share a little bit about that experience with you, because it really solidified my belief that that ALICE and some of these other really important groups, the work they're doing in advocating for progressive policies is more needed and more important than ever. And that belief was really solidified when I was at the ALEC conference. First of all, this is different already because at ALEC there are no cameras, I have to say. So you're actually filming this. That would never ever happen at ALEC. It's extremely, there's a lot of secrecy to ALEC. I actually joined, I became a member, and so they could not exclude me from this conference. Now, it's going to be interesting when I go back, because now I've written a lot about, I wrote a piece that was Friday in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that I was amazed they published, but they did. I had to change a couple things, but they did publish it. And then I blogged for the Progressive, so the Progressive magazine, and they're going to do a bigger story on this. So who knows if I'm ever going to be allowed back, but I am a member, and so I got to go. But the secrecy was so palpable. I really was not able to get much information by email from ALEC about what the agenda was, what the topics were. In fact, nothing. I got a bootleg version of the agenda when I was on the train to Chicago to go to the conference. So really, really very secret. You don't go anywhere in ALEC without a name badge. You have to wear your name badge everywhere you go. I've never been to a conference like that before. If you don't have your name badge, you don't get in to whatever the workshop or the task force meeting. You have to sign in to everything you go to. So any kind of subcommittee meeting I went to or task force meeting, I had to sign my name in. So, very, very secret. Nothing, and I go to a lot of conferences, not experienced anything like this previously. The infrastructure is both horrifying and fascinating of ALEC. And you did a really good job of kind of capturing some of it. But how ALEC works, it is really a menage a trois, and that is really the apt description of it, between big corporations, right-wing think tanks, and state legislatures. So the big corporations, and you showed some of them, it's really tobacco, coal, a lot of insurance, chambers of commerce, very heavily represented, who pay a lot of money to be on one of ALEC's, I think you said there were 8 task force on all kinds of different topics, but really mostly looking at economic issues, what they would say the free market. So corporations pay a lot of money to be represented on these task force, where they have a vote on these model bills that are proposed and come up. The other members on the task force are what they call public members, legislators. And legislators also, in theory, are supposed to be represented on these task force and have a say in some of these model bills. Both the private members and the public members on the task force vote to adopt model bills. And either one, either private or public, can kill a model bill. Okay, so in order for a model bill to actually proceed to becoming a model bill and get up on their website, and you should all look at their website, it's very, very interesting. And obviously, you want to go to ALEC's website too. You should go to ALEC's website and kind of see how what they do and how they do it. But in order to become a model bill, get up on the website and actually have some teeth behind it, both sectors have to pass these model bills in the task force meetings. So that's kind of how it works. The corporations really supply the money. Okay, they grease ALEC's wheels. But the other really important thing that they do, which I wasn't so aware of, is they funnel campaign contributions to legislators. And that's really where, in my opinion, the problem is the money that is involved in this infrastructure. I can talk to whoever I want as a legislator. You know, I'm at 35,000 feet. I don't know everything about everything. I rely on people to help educate me about certain issues. And sometimes that means talking to lobbyists. I lobbied for Planned Parenthood. So I don't have anything against lobbyists. The thing that I think is so problematic, and this is a difference between ALICE and ALEC, and I was asked this question by a student. I thought it was a really good question. Well, you lobbied. You probably wanted certain bills to be passed. That is true. That is absolutely true. I worked on a bill called the Compassionate Care for Rape Victims bill. But the influence of these corporations, I have never seen anything like it. I really haven't. And the Center for Media and Democracy has done a great job about looking at the money that is funneled to the state legislators, who really are the foot soldiers of ALEC. In my observations and just looking how these task force meetings go, there's also subcommittees. So each task force has a certain topic area, and then there are a bunch of subcommittees under the task force, which are also composed of private and public members who have an equal voting say, have an equal say in discussion of these model policies. They make a non-binding recommendation to the task force. So I actually got to observe that process too, which was very interesting. But what I observed was the legislators, the public members, always lost. When they, you know, I was in a subcommittee meeting on business issues, and they brought up the issue of unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance and workers' comp, we're going to see a lot of attacks on these two programs in our state legislature. And once I went to ALEC, I understood where it was coming from, because there was a lot of discussion about making it harder to get unemployment insurance and making it harder to get workers' compensation. But in this one subcommittee meeting, there was a bill that would require a temporary worker, before they got unemployment insurance, to go back to the temporary agency and make sure there was no other work for that worker. And one of the legislators on this subcommittee said, well, look, we should make sure that in this model bill, there's a notice provision so that the employer is protected. So the employee can't come back and say, I didn't know about this. I didn't know I had to come back before going on to get unemployment insurance. And there was such a backlash from the private members for this requirement, because in their opinion, it put additional burdens on employers. And there was a legislator there from Mississippi who represented, in his words, a very, very poor part of the state, who actually did articulate how important it was for him to support this model bill, that it have a notice provision to protect the employee. Well, ultimately, the model bill passed without any kind of notice provision. There was an extensive discussion, but the corporations always won. They always won. And legislators very rarely brought up any issues with model bills. So they were really the driving force, the corporations. And the other piece of kind of the three-legged stool is the right-wing policy think tanks. The State Policy Network has a right-wing think tank in every single state in the country. In fact, we have two here in Wisconsin. And what they do is make sure legislators have the talking points, the research, anything you need, they will get you. In fact, I was told this repeatedly. Anything I needed, call them. Any kind of research, and I left ALEC literally. I had so much stuff that I had to get another person who was there, who was coming back to Wisconsin, to carry some of it back for me, because I was absolutely loaded down. So that's what they do. The money goes to the legislators, and any resource that you need, they will get you. So it was, you know, it was really, really quite fascinating. You know, some of the attacks I think that are going to come are on higher education. I went to an education task force that the chairs of this particular task force made it very, very clear that public universities are unreformable from within. And what needs to be done is to shine the brightest spotlight possible on public universities and humiliate and shame them so that taxpayers will not want any of their taxpayer dollars to go to public universities, because public universities are not educating people to get jobs. I mean, that's really what it is. So I can tell you there's probably 3 or 4 policies that I bet we're going to see in this legislature attacking public universities. And Stephen Nass, who is a big critic of public university, is now, guess what he is? He's the chair of the Education Task Force for ALEC. So we're going to see more of that. And the one other story that I want to tell is, and this gave me some hope. I was actually feeling quite sick during this conference, realizing the movement that they have made. You know, the issue of civil justice issues, just closing the courthouse doors to people who are injured, taking away the jurisdiction of courts. That's another thing we're seeing more of in our state. We actually have a bill pending that would allow the lifting of an injunction to occur by the mere act of filing an appeal. So when there's an injunction on the voter ID bill right now, or the photo ID bill right now, the mere act of filing an appeal under this bill, which passed the state assembly, and I think it's going to pass the Senate, means that injunction is lifted. So taking away a court's ability to provide injunctive relief to plaintiffs, which has been incredibly important in our history, particularly when you look at civil rights and human rights issues, incredibly important. So I suspect, you know, that a lot of those things are coming right from ALEC. Just in the area of tort reform, ALEC has had 200 model bills be passed, 200 in the last couple legislative sessions, in that one area alone. So they have been very, very successful. The interesting thing, well, one of the very interesting things was that as a state legislator, we were really admonished at various points of this conference for not doing more, that we weren't doing enough, and that we were ceding a lot of our power to the courts, to the federal government. So it really was a call to action, a continued call to action to state legislators to step it up and do more to fight global warming, do more to fight the power of the courts. And so a lot of these issues, a lot of these things that I saw at ALEC, I see, they were so familiar to me, sadly. They were so familiar to me because I thought, oh, that's where that's coming from. Oh, yeah, I saw that one too. But the thing that does give me hope, in addition to these efforts, which I think are so, so, so important, so I really hope you all get engaged and involved. So many times we're considering policies in the state legislature that impact you, and you're not there. You're here. You're getting your education. You're doing what you need to do. And so much, and I think this is probably the most heartbreaking thing for me as a legislator, to see the damage that is being done to you, your future, to my children, what opportunities they're not going to have because of these actions. So my last kind of ALEC story is we were on a bus on the way to the Chicago Planetarium, and every night there's a big reception that a corporation pays for. So there's a lot of corporate sponsorship of wining and dining. The Keystone Pipeline people sponsored an ice cream sundae little soiree, and the ice cream started to melt, which I thought was such justification. You know, I kind of felt really vindictive, that vindicated that their ice cream was melting. See, global warming is not just a natural solar cycle, which is what they say. But a guy sat down next to me and he said, we were on the bus going to Chicago Planetarium. I thought this is so appropriate because I was feeling like I had been on another planet the whole day. Who said, oh, I want to talk to you about, you know, our efforts to amend the federal Constitution. This is another big thing with ALEC right now, is amending the federal Constitution to take away the power of the federal government. All powers, really, of the federal government. And he said, don't you think it would be great if we did a constitutional amendment requiring congressional approval of all federal regulations? really getting at some of the environmental stuff. And ALEC hates the EPA, they hate the Endangered Species Act. I mean, I can go through the whole litany of things that they're very opposed to. And I said, you know, no, I actually don't think that that's a good idea. And I didn't say, you know, I kind of went to ALEC saying, I'm not going to lie about who I am. Somebody asked me if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to say I'm a Democrat. Nobody asked me, though. So I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's very inspiring for people. That why would people want to turn out and amend the federal Constitution over some kind of regulatory thing? Nobody's going to understand what it is. I don't think the people are going to support it. And he says, well, we have 24 state legislatures where we also have a Republican governor. And we have all the money that we could want from the corporations. So we really don't need the people. And then he said to me, boy, I'm so happy to be here at ALEC because I don't have to be worried about who's sitting behind me. And I thought you should be worried about who's sitting beside you. But that is the epitome of really what this effort by ALEC has represented, is to sidestep the people and sidestep democracy. So I think that it's so important, it's important for me as a progressive to not just say what I don't want, but to advocate for what I want, even when it might not happen right away. And that's why I learned Planned Parenthood. My God, we worked on some of the bills that eventually passed for decades. Comprehensive sex ed, that bill had been around for 10 years before it passed. So I think that these efforts really give me hope that we have a place to go as legislators, not to take marching orders from corporations, but to look for really good public policy that actually helps people's lives, that actually improves people's lives, which I think is the central purpose of government, is to create opportunities for people, is to improve people's lives, not to advance a corporate agenda that doesn't help most people. And that's where I really think progressives can win this struggle. It's because we are on the side of the people. And eventually the people know that. So I would, once again, just thank you all for being here. I applaud these efforts. I've been on the ALICE website. It's such a good resource for legislators that we can look and see on any issue that we're interested in working at, what is some really good policy. But it also enables us, and this is what we don't do well enough on the progressive side, to share what we work on. I post a lot of bills that I work on the ALICE website, so people can see what I'm doing. One of the bills that I'm working on right now, thank you, Mel Barnes. I have to point Mel out, who's one of my interns. I'm working on a bill right now. There is no model for this bill. There's no other state in the country who's ever done this bill, and it's on independent police investigations where there is an officer involved death, because this has been an issue in my community. And I don't know if it's a progressive issue or a conservative issue, frankly. It's an issue that there's nothing on. So we've kind of created this bill, and it is a ton of research and work. And most legislators don't have a fabulous, awesome legal intern like I have to do a lot of this research. But it takes a lot to create a piece of legislation when you really have no reference point for it. It's just really helpful to have an ability to go to a place like ALICE, to see what others have done, to get ideas, to share your ideas. That is how we build a progressive infrastructure. The right has done it. It has fundamental flaws, though, fundamental flaws, in that people are disregarded, in my opinion. So this is an opportunity for us to put good policy and people first. So I really thank you for all of your work, Joel. I think it's amazing. And I really encourage you all to please, I know you're so busy. I was a law student. I know you feel like you don't have one more minute in your life to spare. But this is a great investment in building the country that you want. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Joel has told everybody a lot about what ALICE is, and Chris has talked about the incredible impact that ALEC has had unchallenged lo these many years in state legislatures. And I was given a rather more limited charge, and that is to try to talk a bit about how those of you who want to help ALICE, and you've all stayed this long, so I trust you're in that category, might enhance your ability to identify legislative opportunities for change. Because the fact is, we have labored for quite some time under a tendency to think in terms of litigation as the impact or law reform vehicle. When we look at the weapons in the lawyer's arsenal, we as a nation have been impressed by landmark cases, Brown versus Board and Gideon versus Wainwright. And those of us who came to political consciousness and studied law back when the Warren Court was still a vital institution probably thought that was going to go on forever. And of course it hasn't. That's the national obstacle to thinking beyond litigation, but we've also got, those of us who inhabit legal education, the additional obstacle of Langdellian case method. You know, what do you study in law school? You read appellate judicial opinions. You could reasonably graduate from law school thinking that the vast bulk of the meaningful law in our society is written by appellate judges because it's what you read day in and day out, when in fact vast amounts of law are written by legislative bodies, state and national and municipal, and an even vaster body of law is written by administrative agencies in the form of agency rulemaking. So we need to think creatively about how we might counter this mindset. When the Public Law Center kicked off now 25 or more years ago, we had to educate not only clients but also legal services and public interest lawyers and advocacy groups and faculty colleagues about what it was we did as a legislative advocacy program. Legislative drafting ideas are not instinctive, they're not self-evident, they require a certain mental shift. And to build that understanding, how to think legislatively, I want to talk about a couple of specific instances drawn from the Public Law Center's experience. The first of which involves an horrific case some years ago of the Anselman family, consisting of a couple of neglectful parents, 3 siblings who remained alive, and unfortunately a deceased baby girl, 2 years old, died of malnutrition. And all of this took place during the not so watchful vigil of the Department of Social Services. This was a family in need of supervision, and our DSS did not do a particularly good job of it. So in a sense, we were all implicated in the death of that 2-year-old girl. When the Public Law Center was approached about a possible wrongful death action, we looked at the Civil Code, Article 2315.2, and we saw that the suit may be brought by the following persons. Well, number one was not relevant. A 2-year-old girl doesn't have a surviving spouse or children. Number two was the problem. The father and mother were not going to bring a lawsuit against themselves. And so the third right of action existing in the surviving brothers and sisters was undermined by the presence of 2. It would have to have been brought by the parents. Well, you could hardly ask for a more compelling set of facts in which to try to assert a law reform litigation opportunity. But it would have had to have overcome a number of obstacles. To find a judicial solution, you'd have had to have removed the parents. You'd have had to have appointed a curator and then created a judge-made exception recognizing the right of action in the siblings. We thought that was a challenging burden, and so we thought instead about a legislative alternative. And happily, we had a grand relationship with the President Pro Tem of the Senate at that time, Dennis Bagneris. We brought this bill to him after the deadline for introduction of legislation had expired. Dennis got the rules suspended in order to have the bill introduced. It was legislation that was rather hard to oppose. It passed out of both committees and through both floors without a negative vote cast against it, wound up on the governor's desk, and so lo and behold, the Bagneris legislation created a right of action where the parent had been the agent of the child's demise, created the right of action in the other survivors, in this case the 3 surviving siblings. So that was a legislative success story that probably would not have had quite such a happy ending, and the target, by the way, in this litigation was not the parents who had no money. That was, I'm sure, at the root of a lot of the problems. The target was the state of Louisiana and the Department of Social Services that had done such a wretched job of not supervising the family that this unfortunate death had occurred. So that's one part of the equation, thinking legislatively. Let's talk a little bit about the equally powerful administrative rulemaking process, and a little bit of terminology clarification at the outset. I use rules and regulations interchangeably. The parliamentary systems around the globe have a very apt description of this. They call it subordinate legislation. It is promulgated by ministries. And I like that because rules and regs seem to have a sort of a pale profile in our legal system. They are just as effective legally as legislation. They are arguably more malleable. The administrative agency can initiate a rulemaking project at any time, so you could revise it a little more easily than you can revise legislation. In Louisiana, our legislature meets but once a year, so you could argue that legislation is a little more stable, but it's also frequently harder to get. There is a relationship between regulatory and statutory law, described somewhat as a seesaw. That's a bit distracting, so I'll freeze it. But detailed, self-educating statutes create a diminished need for agency regulations. You could say in the grand scheme of things that statutory law empowers legislative bodies. Correspondingly, if you pass a measure with minimal statutory detail, it creates the opportunity for an agency to step in and fill in the details by way of regulatory law, and that empowers the executive branch and the administrative agencies of government. Well, the fact that there is this seesaw relationship between legislation and regulation suggests that you can use them strategically. And here's an example drawn from the Public Law Center's experience. In 1987, Congress, in the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, called upon states to create systems of intermediate sanctions for nursing homes. Our local newspaper editorialized on this subject, and they said, we need something other than the fly swatter of a compliance letter that essentially says to the nursing home, you're out of compliance with our requirements, get with the program, and isn't backed up by any enforcement authority. Or on the other hand, the atom bomb of license revocation. You know, we're going to close you down, we're going to put all your employees out of work and all those residents on the street. Not a happy outcome. So again, we went to Dennis Bagneris. We drafted legislation that provided for a graduated system of civil fines, increasing with the severity and the frequency of the violation. We created an opportunity for compliance monitors who could issue orders and enforce them. In certain instances, we thought it appropriate that perhaps a receiver should take over the home and operate it for a while, and of course, ultimately, if need be, license revocation. Well, now this was a 22-page bill by the time we had drafted it. I don't know how it is in Wisconsin, but in Louisiana, a 22-page bill might as well have a bullseye painted on it. It's going to be suspect, and the nursing home lobby is going to make a big target out of it, and so they did. We had trouble getting it heard. 3 times we appeared with AARP and Citizens for Quality Nursing Home Care, all there in their silver-haired glory representing. And 3 times that cowardly committee backed off and said, we want to give you a hearing on a day when we can really give this more attention, so we're going to put it off for a while. And then finally they took it up and they did major surgery on it. We had a 22-page bill. By the time we came out of committee, it was 2 pages in length, and it essentially said to the Department of Health and Human Resources, draft us some rules to comply with this bothersome federal legislation. I told people I went in with a Great Dane, and I came out with a Dachshund. And I usually add, I wish I'd been smart enough to think of that right from the get-go, because you know what it did? It created an opportunity to do the hard work of powerful remedies in an administrative rather than a legislative context where there is never enough time in those compressed circumstances to really achieve all of the details. And so before the bill even hit the governor's desk, we had a letter off from AARP and Citizens for Quality Nursing Home Care saying, why don't you and the department convene the stakeholders around a table and let's do a negotiated rulemaking? And he did, and we did. We had the 2 consumer groups, Citizens and AARP. We had the 2 nursing home groups, one representing for-profit homes, one representing the nonprofits, and the agency. And over the course of a dozen or more meetings in the next 3 or 4 months, we worked out what I would consider to have been about a 90% consensus on some very powerful remedies that were promulgated in a regulatory context. The lobbyists weren't there. I mean, the lobbyists, of course, were everywhere in the legislative process, but they don't sit in on negotiated rulemaking sessions. You know, that's for the administrators of these enterprises to deal with. So what can we say about deconstructing litigation and legislative thinking? Well, this is painting with a broad brush. It's not a philosophical system that will withstand rigorous analysis. It's a sketch that is intended to invite a kind of intuitive understanding of what are the differences. Well, here's one difference. Litigation plays out between two or more contesting parties. Legislation, on the other hand, has a broader focus. You could say, in a sense, that the legislative lawyer is a lawyer for the issues. Another difference, litigation tends to look back and focus on specific facts with a kind of microscopic attention, whereas legislation looks forward, takes a big picture perspective. In a sense, what I've described in this slide are the two Western lawmaking methodologies, common law and civil code jurisdictions. Louisiana, for most of you, I'm sure it's known, is a civil code jurisdiction. We are a little island in a sea of 49 other common law jurisdictions, not to mention the federal government. So we're aware of some of these differences, and in the common law, out of a series of ad hoc decisions by judges picking apart individual fact situations, ultimately come general principles of law, whereas in the civil code system, the code tries to articulate those principles with the expectation that it will later be applied to resolve specific factual disputes. And I think they're roughly descriptive of what goes on in a litigation versus a legislative context. What else sets them apart? Well, here I'm playing off that stereotype of the Buddha and navel-gazing. Litigation tends to be inward-looking and analytical, but you know what? The Buddha is a versatile guy. He's also about universal mind and the global perspective, and that, I think, is somewhat descriptive of legislation, looking out at change opportunities. So how does change happen in these two contexts? Well, litigation is constrained by the current legal context. Obviously, the ambition is to change it with law reform or impact litigation, but change essentially arises out of the existing constitutional and statutory landscape. And for this, I have put in a law book. And in a moment of absolute departure from the subject, I'm going to share with you an anecdote about the late, great Earl Long, one of our crazy Louisiana governors. If any of you have seen the movie Blaze, where Paul Newman filled out the Earl Long character a good bit better than the original, Earl once said of an attorney general in Louisiana, "If you want to hide something from Jack Grimion, put it in a law book." Legislation is mostly unconstrained by current law, but it is change constrained by political considerations. So what are some of those political considerations? Well, ideally, legislation should be as simple as it can be, but not simpler. You're all familiar, I'm sure, with that KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. There are no bonus points for complexity in legislative drafting. Simple as it can be, but not simpler. Ideally, it would be susceptible of implementation without generating a fiscal note that costs plenty millions of dollars. In Louisiana, we know we're swimming uphill with our legislative agenda from the get-go. If it has a price tag attached to it, that's usually enough to pull it below the waves. But, you know, it's nice if it's at least somewhat feasible politically, but we recognize that our reach needs to exceed our grasp, and there is a whole nother type of legislative advocacy that might respond, for example, to organizing considerations. If your objective is an aspirational and an inspirational legislative initiative that may not ultimately be successful, that's perfectly legitimate. It helps to know at the outset which of these games you're playing, and I'll give you one example. The inside game and the outside game. As long as we had this great relationship with Dennis Bagneris, we could take our cases up there, our projects, our bills, and they would noodle along rather quietly, a kind of submarine legislative program. We were relying on Dennis's relationship with his colleagues and his mastery of the legislative process to get it done without a lot of fanfare. On the other hand, when we went up there with our nursing home bill, we showed up in force. There is the type of legislative initiative that invites the rally on the Capitol steps, and I call the first one the inside game and the other one the outside game. And the point here is you can only play them in one direction. You can move from the inside game to the outside game if that seems necessary. You can't go the other way around. Once you've surfaced this issue vividly, you don't then count on your inside players to help make it happen. So it's important to know, I think, what your primary objective is and to let your strategy be governed accordingly. Okay, so conclusions about legislation and litigation. They're both creative and imaginative, but they express creativity and imagination in different ways. Litigation tends to think inside the box of existing law. Legislation tends to be an outside of the box experience without borders beyond the pale. So in concluding these remarks, let's do an exercise. Connect all the dots by drawing 4 lines without lifting your pen from the page. We're going to see now whether we have sound effects. I suspect not. So if at first you don't succeed, that's supposed to go whap, 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 whap. Try again. Whap, 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 whap. Didn't get it there either. How about a third try again? 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, if you think outside of the box, remember I never said you had to stay within inside those 9 dots. And here is where the 2001 theme music was supposed to come up. You just might find that you get what you need. So without the benefit of that dramatic fanfare of music, I am happy to say that these remarks are concluded and the panel are now open to questions.